Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are, of course, going to be talking about yesterday's historic Moldovan runoff presidential election, for which we have a clear result. It's a refreshing thing to see that within just a few hours as opposed to ongoing uncertainty. And that gives us a chance to have really an in-depth discussion about everything that the vote, the process that ran up to it, the candidates, the teams that they lead, and the policies that we're likely to see, foreign and domestic, what all of that means. And I truly couldn't be joined by a better panel of experts and practitioners to talk about this. I will introduce all three of them before they speak. But before I do that, let me just note that you can keep up with all of our events and analysis at the Kennan Institute via our new podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File, as well as our blogs, the Russia File and Focus Ukraine. And throughout the course of today's discussion, which I'll try to keep moving along quickly because we've only budgeted just a little more than an hour, you can submit your questions at any time, including right now, if you already know what you want to ask, via email to Kennan, that's Kennan, at wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet at Kennan Institute, or you can post the questions to our Facebook page. They will appear in a magic real-time document that I have in front of me. Simply just make sure to include your name and affiliation if you have one. It will make it more likely that I will get your question in front of me and ask it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ambassador Bill Hill, who's a global fellow at the Kennan Institute, a former professor of national security strategy at the National War College, and a distinguished former foreign service officer who's an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union, East-West relations, and European multilateral diplomacy. Relevant to our discussion today, especially, he served twice as head of the OSCE mission in Moldova, from January 2003 to July 2006, and then again from June 1999 to November 2001. There he was charged with leading negotiations on a political settlement to the Transnistria conflict and facilitating the withdrawal of Russian forces, arms, and ammunition from Moldova. So to lead off on some of the many questions that I posed, and maybe to pose some questions for our other two panelists, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks very much to Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center for putting on this program. And I'm delighted to be joined by former Minister Nicu Popescu and Christina Garassimov, two really good analysts and observers of events in Moldova. Yesterday, it was really a great victory for Maia Sandu, for her party, the Party of Action and Solidarity, and for pro-integration voters, the majority of the population in Moldova that favors greater contact with and integration in Europe. The election has been set up by many observers and commentators as a geopolitical contest. And so with a decisive victory of President-elect Sandu, is this a geopolitical result? Well, perhaps. I mean, in the past, over the past 25 years, there's been a pattern in Moldovan elections where the Moldovan population has been split fairly evenly between left and right, between pro-West and pro-Russian population or groups in the population. And the results of elections have generally been close to 50-50. Any move too far in one direction or the other has generally produced a pretty emphatic popular reaction and a movement back towards the middle or the center, or whatever you want to call it. And so while Moldova has been sometimes reputed to be moving towards Moscow and sometimes towards the EU or Brussels, it's never gotten fully too far in either direction. The current election had significant domestic issues, which I think we'll all talk about a little bit, but it also is geopolitical in a way. The Russian leadership, in pre-election comments by Foreign Minister Lavrov, head of the National Security Council Narishkin, and President Putin indicated that Russia saw a stake in the contest in this election. So at least at one point, Moscow, as well as some observers in the West, viewed it that way. That said, I think coming out of the election, the results are not going to be drastic, or the results of the outcome. And Ms. Sandu, assuming the presidency, are not likely to move too quickly or too dramatically in one direction. The clear result is certainly going to make it easier for President Sandu to deal with the EU, and for the EU to deal with her and with Moldova and to cooperate. Yet, on the other hand, the Russians have quickly extended an olive branch. Putin sent a fairly decent congratulatory telegram. Peskov echoed those sentiments. And the Kremlin and Moscow has indicated a readiness to work with the new president. We'll see what comes of that. The thing is that there are significant domestic issues here and ongoing domestic problems that may or may not overshadow the geopolitical elements here. There's been continuing popular discontent with poverty, corruption, lack of opportunity in Moldova, and this has all been multiplied by the effects of the pandemic over the past 8 months, with the ineffectual response of Moldova's present leadership. There's a continuing hope for greater integration in Europe, and I think, at least from what I've heard from at least several friends on the ground in Moldova who worked for her campaign, they attribute the electoral success to President-elect Sandu moving a bit towards the center and being more inclusive in the campaign, and then drawing in groups that did not traditionally support center-right candidates or pro-Western candidates. Where did this support come from? Well, you have to look within Moldova. The result was clear, but considerably less emphatic. Sandu won with voters inside the country, 52 to 48%. And the really large percentage, the 57 to 43% result, comes largely from a stunning vote from the Moldovan diaspora, where 250,000 Moldovans abroad voted overwhelmingly for President-elect Sandu. I think the result is something like 240,000 to 14,000, just an incredible margin. This has never happened before in the history of Moldovan elections. What it means for the future is something that we're all going to be struggling to understand. Dodon and the socialists got support from the traditional regions, the north of the country, the south in Gagauzia, from the Transnistrian region, although the margin was not that great. It voted 9-1 for Sandu, but not that many from Transnistria voted. That one of the key elements in the electoral coalition that Sandu put together was getting Mayor Renato Usati of our party, Partidul Nostru. Usati is allegedly pro-Russian. The mayor of the heavily Russophone second city in Moldova, Bielsk, but he actively campaigned against Dodon in the second round, and through his support to Sandu, and it's clear that his city went for Sandu over, Bielsk went for Sandu over Dodon, which is really unprecedented. That's not what you would expect. Will these forces stay together in the post-election scenario? This is an important question, because Sandu's victory is only the first step. The government and the parliament are still dominated by the old Democratic Party, post-Plakhatniuk forces, or continuing Plakhatniuk forces, and by the socialists. And Moldova is more a parliamentary republic than a presidential republic. The president does have significant powers, but they're not decisive. And so will this electoral alliance with Usati and others hold? What will be the fate of the current government? Will there be new elections? Both Sandu and Usati have indicated they will push for early parliamentary elections to try to get a new majority in the parliament and a different, more cooperative government. But this is going to be crucial because internal questions are really going to be important in Moldova. Rule of law, judicial reform, the fight against corruption. These are areas in which Moldova recently has continually disappointed its external partners, even the pro-Western, allegedly pro-Western governments that have been in power in Moldova over a great majority of the past decade. So we'll see. Sandu's victory may indicate a shakeup in Moldova's electoral pattern, the electoral pattern of the past 25 years. And this could be a good thing because it could allow Moldova also to break out then of this pattern of electing a new pro-reform, pro-European, pro-Western government that then disappoints those who supported it and leads to yet another wave of popular discontent, a new election, a new government, and yet another disappointment. So I am hopeful. And I think certainly the scope and nature of this victory holds a promise that we may not have seen for a long time in Moldova. Let's see, and let's be hopeful, and let's work to help it out. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. That's a great overview. I want to go right to Christina Garassimov, who's a research fellow at the Robert Bosch Center for Central and Eastern Europe, Russia and Central Asia at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she worked at Transparency International Defense and Security and at Chatham House with the Russia and Eurasia program. Her expertise includes democratic transitions and institution building in Central and Eastern Europe and post-communist states, European integration, good governance, rule of law, anti-corruption policy, and democratic backsliding. Other than maybe the last one, that almost sounds like a wish list for the new government, Cristina. So interested to hear your take, please.
Many thanks, Matthew, and thank you to the Kennan Institute for inviting me to join this discussion. So I think since William Hill started, from the geopolitics of this election, I will let myself this time to start with a value base of this election, since Moldovans, don't have too many options or too many occasions to speak about that, and I think it's something that we would like to witness more often. So what Moldova saw yesterday was really, a historical vote for dignity and integrity, something that probably many Americans could relate to as well in light of your own elections. And it was also a vote against the current political establishment, against hate speech, a vote against sexism, xenophobia, and division of people along identity lines such as language and ethnicity that we've seen being overwhelmingly used, particularly in the last 2 weeks. So this victory should be attributed mainly to two groups, the way I see it. One is that of Maia Sandu and her team, who worked tirelessly to reach out to every Moldovan inside the country and abroad. And the second group would be the 260K Moldovans who voted abroad despite COVID, despite bad weather, despite the long lines and obstacles to cast their vote freely due to the very long distances many of them had to cross to reach a polling station. So the fact that Maia won this election, despite a very denigratory campaign during the last 2 weeks in particular, a lot of violations of the electoral law in the pre-electoral campaign, to mention only a few, the intense use of hate speech, widespread disinformation, undeclared electoral financing, and no real swift action by law enforcement authorities to address these, which then undercut the level playing field for the two candidates. Despite the heavy interference of Russian technologists in support of President Dodon, the busing of voters from the Transnistrian region, and the unusually high numbers of polling stations opened in Russia, the fact that Maia won this election despite all of these challenges and help that President Dodon got, should really be treated as a big win for the Moldovan society, which throughout the last 4 years has partially lost trust in a better future and made tens of thousands of Moldovans leave the country. It is also one of the first positive developments, I would say, in the region for a long time now, and this brings some hope after a series of developments that raise serious questions about the region's future political and geopolitical landscape. So what does this runoff election result tell us? Polls published in the run-up of the election showed that Maia Sandu and President Dodon would be in a tight race that was to be decided by the diaspora, which voted massively in the first round for Maia Sandu, around 70%. In 2016, what we saw was something very similar in terms of risks, and Dodon defeated Sandu by less than 5 percentage points in an election that was marred by allegations of fraud. So the key battlegrounds, again, this year were expected to be the vote of the diaspora and the vote from the Transnistrian region. So the risks involved around these voter groups have mobilized people inside and outside the country to maximize the chances to avoid a repeated scenario of 2016. The diaspora, like William Hill has also mentioned, mobilized like never before. For the first round, this level of mobilization was already unexpectedly high. In the second round, it reached 16% of the total vote. But this also tells us, in the absence of official statistics, how many people left the country in the last 4 years in the search of a better future. And for those who voted for Maia Sandu from abroad, 50% were young people between, depending how you categorize young people, between 25 and 40 years old, and 25% were basically between 41 and 55. So we see, the whole labor force basically being abroad and voting massively for Maia Sandu. In the second round, the mobilization could have been also caused by a remark of President Dodon that the diaspora lives in a parallel world, which has anchored a lot of people. He also did not realize making this mistake until a few days later, but at that time it was already too late, because this has been then used by the diaspora to mobilize those who did not vote in the first round. And to quickly refer to the Transnistrian region vote, because Bill has already referred to that a bit as well. We did see fraud there, we cannot deny it, but in smaller scale than many have expected. Out of the 31,000 who cast their vote, around 85% were for President Dodon. But I think the attention that was raised over the Transnistrian votes and their possible manipulation left a very narrow space for maneuver for President Dodon. Dodon also, lost inside the country with much bigger difference in votes than most experts expected. Therefore, the Transnistrian votes in this case did not count as much as they did last time, when the margin of his victory was much smaller. So Dodon lost inside the country, he lost the vote in the capital, he lost the vote abroad, which doesn't make him a very good leader of the Socialist Party in the near future. Maia got in the diaspora 93% of the votes. Think what this means for a democratic context, not a dictatorial one. And I think what is also equally shameful for Dodon personally, because he has used these arguments against Maia, is that he also lost to a woman, he lost to a single woman, and he also lost to a woman who yet has no children. These are his words that he used against her. And I think this is a big thing for him, because I hope this teaches many populists and machos of his kind to be careful with such words, with such narrative in future electoral campaigns, because they might backfire pretty badly. So what does this mean for the near future? And try to be very short here. Expectations from Maia's presidency are very high. These are shaped by a disastrous domestic context, no management of the COVID pandemic whatsoever, no meaningful support for the economy, for the vulnerable people who have been hit very hard by the current situation, but also, by the rampant corruption that drained the state budget for the last 5 years at least. Moreover, as it has already been mentioned, Moldova is a parliamentary republic, something that President Dodon remembered this morning and also reminded everyone else in his press statement. But the president has also somewhat disbalanced high legitimacy because he or she is elected directly by the people rather than by the parliament. So the president's powers stay mostly in the realm of foreign and security policy, and that's where President-elect Sandu could have a difference. Domestically, she has a say in appointing judges, prosecutors, ambassadors, high-level appointees. She can raise to the parliament issues related to the functioning of the state, the judicial reform that she will definitely do. But ultimately, it is upon a functioning government and legislative support in the parliament to help implement the changes that she envisions, which at the moment she badly misses. So therefore, we need to, employ this cautious optimism about what we can expect from Maia in the next 4 years. What we will definitely see on the bright side, to finish here, is much more international support, more open doors for cooperation internationally and from our direct neighbors, something that Moldova has lagged behind under Dodon's 4-year rule, with a small intermission during the Sandu government last year. And I will stop here for now.
Thanks very much, Cristina. Let me remind those listening in, if you'd like to ask a question, email it to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet at Kennan Institute, or post on our Facebook page, and please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. So we've gotten plenty of questions in, but I just want to encourage you, if anybody has any others. We've sort of danced around geopolitics and foreign policy, but of course, Cristina accurately said this is the principal role of the president. And so I want to turn to my old friend, Nicu Popescu, who is, of course, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Integration of Moldova, currently Director of the Wider Europe Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's also previously worked as a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, a senior advisor on foreign policy to Moldova's Prime Minister, a senior research fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations London office, and a research fellow at Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. With all those senior titles, you wouldn't even believe how young Nicu actually is. He teaches at Sciences Po in Paris, making him one of those Moldovans abroad that we've been talking about. And he is the author of EU Foreign Policy in Post-Soviet Conflicts, Stealth Intervention, and co-editor of Democratization in EU Foreign Policy, published in 2015. So Nicu, with that out of the way, what's going to happen now with Moldova's foreign policy and relations with the rest of the world?
Thanks a lot. Just very briefly, so that we have time for a conversation. I think it's really important to remind everyone that Moldova is the only post-Soviet country where all changes of power happened through elections. I think that's hugely important to remember. This is a kind of regular democratic exercise. There's lots of imperfect things, but several times leaders in Moldova have tried to assert authoritarian rule, and that failed. And those attempts failed not through revolutions, not through bloodshed, but through elections. So I'm very positive from one election to another as to how relatively sophisticated and relatively mature is the Moldovan electorate, giving the country's GDP per capita and relatively short history of democratic rule and governance. On the foreign policy front, Moldova is in a very difficult geopolitical context. We've seen just recent events, how difficult that context is. The war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the stalled reform process in Ukraine, protests in Belarus. That's a very complicated environment in which Moldova operates. At the same time, I'm optimistic in the sense that Moldova is going and is living through this environment with several good cards. Now, William Hill referred a lot to the way Moldovan politics is divided, and Moldovan politicians have changed between rather pro-Russian, rather pro-Western, this roughly 50-50 split when you look at the foreign policy preferences of the electorate, and that's all true. But besides that, and on top of that or beneath that, there have been several structural changes happening in Moldova. And I'll just throw in some statistics. Last year, Moldova exported 65% of its exports went to the European Union, 9% went to the Russian market. In August, just 3 months ago, Moldova has been connected to the European Union's gas market by finalizing the building of a gas pipeline, which has been prepared and has been, the pipeline was in the pipeline for several years, but now it's a real fact. It's a real hard piece of hardware for the first time in Moldova's history, allowing Moldova to buy potentially gas from the West in case should it need to. I'll give you another kind of statistics. Many Moldova watchers know that Moldova has been famous for its wine export, and Moldova has been hugely dependent on wine exports, especially to the Russian market, for decades, not just years. The statistics for last year is that Moldova has exported wine worth 170 million lei to Romania, 150 to China, and 110 to Russia. So Russia buys less Moldovan wine than China does. Russia buys roughly as much wine as the Czech Republic. What do all these factors mean? They mean that despite this political division on the popular level, Moldova has been day by day more and more integrated in the economy, into the European economy, which allows Moldova a much higher degree of resilience in the face of external economic pressures than is the case for many other countries, including Georgia or Ukraine. This kind of economic statistics also forced formally pro-Russian politicians like Dodon to accept the association agreement, the deep and comprehensive free trade area with the European Union, and not do anything substantial to really connect Moldova to the Eurasian Union. So Dodon spoke a lot about it, but he couldn't do anything because Moldovan trade dependencies did not allow for that. So in this sense, despite the kind of changing and shifting pendulum on the political level, over the years, Moldova has been gradually, increasingly, and irreversibly being more and more tied to Europe. Russia. The relations with Russia will be complex, but what we've been seeing, and William Hill underlined that Maia Sandu explicitly ran a campaign which was as centrist as possible on foreign policy, and is open and very open to Russian speakers in Moldova. So she made sure to campaign, to lead a part of her campaign in Russia. She's been to Gagauzia several times in the last year. She did an explicit attempt to reach out to those sections of the Moldovan electorate. And her line on Russia has been very open. It's her desire to bring Moldova closer to the European Union, but do her best to retain good, respectful, healthy relations with Russia. Why would they be so? For several reasons. Most of you probably know Moldova is a neutral state since 1994. So technically the issue of non-accession to NATO in the case of Moldova is not and should not be an irritant in relations with Russia as they were in the case of Georgia, Ukraine. That offers some decentish parameters to future cooperation with Russia. That's the hope. Of course, it will depend on Russia to a large extent if this offer of pragmatic and respectful interaction will, determine relations in the future or not. We will see. But as I said, Moldova has a geography and a degree of economic resilience that allows Moldova a decentish room for maneuver in foreign policy. And this room for maneuver, I would claim, is bigger than pretty much of any other post-Soviet state. I'll probably stop here.
Thank you very much, Nicu. So we've gotten a bunch of questions in from the audience. Don't hesitate. You're welcome to send in more. I'm probably going to group some of them together. But I do want to start with my own question. I was talking with some colleagues this morning and promised that we wouldn't just do the classic Washington geopolitical questions. And so I want to go right back to you, Cristina. And I want to talk about the expectations that voters had across the board, and also the ways in which maybe the expectations of those who flipped, whether they flipped their support from Usati to Sandu, or maybe they voted for Dodon, but they're not, pouring out in the streets because they hate Sandu. The expectations of people who might otherwise be viewed as obstacles to Sandu's agenda. How is she likely to be able to manage those so that we don't see what I feel like is kind of the classic political cycle of disappointed expectations and then the pendulum kind of swinging back and forth, even setting aside the geopolitics. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Matthew. So if we look at the voting patterns, we will see that Gagauzia still voted for Dodon, so no big change or, pendulum swings there. Transnistrians voted for Dodon. The northern part of Moldova voted for Dodon. But then the rest, we saw this yellow, patch there that voted for Sandu. It's very difficult to say who exactly switched. So what we saw in the polls just before the election is that there were about 30 to 35% of undecided voters. And I think what was different about this campaign that could have mobilized part of them, could have mobilized part of the electorate who gave their votes, for Usate or for other candidates from the first round, is literally her reach out to unite the electorate. So we saw messages in Gagauzian, we saw messages tailored to the youth, we saw messages tailored to the elderly. And I think what she tried to offer is what unites all of them. And these challenges are literally, related to the actual domestic context. No one is taking care or providing a plan for recovery out of the pandemic, something that turned out to be a disaster and actually played against President Dodon. She's trying to, reassure the population that she would be able to provide some kind of economic support to the most vulnerable social groups, but also economic groups such as the SMEs. And she's also very much, orienting her message towards the diaspora, many of who are still ready to come back if there was such an opportunity. In terms of, how much disappointment there could be in the future by not really addressing their needs or their expectations, I think they're quite high. With only looking at the diaspora with 93% of support there, I think there will be disappointed people, but that's something that we cannot avoid. Still, I think the platform that she offered in these elections was much more unifying, much more pacifying, and much more hopeful and reassuring in comparison to the other candidates.
Let me ask, thank you very much, Cristina. Let me ask Bill, if I can, another quick follow-up question. Russia has been mentioned. I think Romania I heard the word Romania once, but it has been common, or at least has happened in the history of Moldovan presidential elections, that the Romanian Moldovan vote plays a significant role. Sometimes Romanian politicians will seek to influence things. What was the Romanian dimension of this entire story? Is there one, and how does that change now that Sandu has won?
Well, I think, it was relatively small. I mean, Romania has its own political problems and has its own election coming up. And there is a pretty serious fight going on in Romania about corruption and governance right now that has Romanian politicians busy at home. But Romania did, is supportive of Moldova and of the directions that Maia Sandu and the party PAS represent. Whether they've been effective is another question. We don't really have time, to debate. I would leave it just that I saw an announcement today. I believe that President Iohannis is going to be the first foreign leader invited to Moldova once President-elect Sandu is inaugurated. So there is a connection there. There's a lot that Romania can do. As Nicu Popescu mentioned, there's the pipeline through, into Ungain that's got to be filled with gas. It gets working. It gives Moldova some options. There are other things that Romania can do, but it's not a magic bullet. And I've found that the attitudes, well, I'll just leave it there. It's something where Romania could be more effective, and a good relationship can be very helpful, but it's not automatic. And despite the fact that they speak the same language, they are two different countries. And if you live there in both of them, as I have, you find that out fairly quickly.
I'm going to abuse my moderator's prerogative one more time for Nicu and ask about relations with Ukraine. It seems to me Ukraine, thanks to COVID, thanks to a still going conflict in the East, although, thankfully with a ceasefire, and then of course the phenomenon of Zelensky, who has already been compared with Sandu in social media, sometimes favorably, sometimes unfavorably. Do you have any sense of what that relationship would look like between the two leaders, but also the ways in which, two societies seeking to undertake reform, seeking to maybe kind of minimize the geopolitical impacts on their domestic development? How do those two stories relate from your perspective, Nicu?
They do relate very well, and they've already intersected last year. So the story is also, if you look at the previous presidency of Dodon, he's never had any kind of proper official interaction with either Romania or Ukraine. He never visited these capitals as a president, and he never received any visits. He was in a kind of complete isolation from Bucharest and Kiev for very specific reasons. And he's tried to break out from that isolation, and it didn't work. Now, in this sense, it will be not very easy, not very difficult to have a major improvement on a relationship that was deeply frozen with Kiev. Now, Maia Sandu has been to Kiev as prime minister in July, just basically weeks after Zelensky was elected and weeks after she became prime minister. I was in that visit. They actually established an excellent personal relationship. It was going very well. There were even things that Moldova needed fixing in its relationship with Ukraine, and there was a small kind of detail. But by the time we landed back in Chisinau in mid-July last year, that governmental decree that we needed from Ukraine was signed by the Ukrainian prime minister. So there was huge amount of practical goodwill from Ukraine to Maia Sandu personally. So now we're looking into picking up that relationship from where it was left. So there is bound to be a positive cooperation on several economic fronts. There will be conversations about how to manage the Transnistrian dossier and file, and that's a delicate one, but Ukraine has been very supportive of the Moldovan approach to that in the last years. And there are some complicated bilateral issues, like there's, Ukraine building some water dams on River Nistru, but they are, you can overcome these problems if you have the political will to do that.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I want to get to some of our many, many audience questions. And let me ask one. We have three related questions from Vlad Lupan, former Moldovan ambassador to the UN, as well as from Ron Bookbinder and from John Todd Stewart, who was US ambassador to Moldova from 95 to 98. So the questions basically have to do with an early parliamentary election. How would it be legal to hold a snap election given the prohibition on doing so within 6 months of a presidential election? If it were to happen either before or after that timeline, would Sandu be able to repeat this performance? In other words, take a majority or a significant plurality in the parliament? And in general, how do you assess the prospects, let's say, for united or divided government? Who wants to take that? Don't be shy. Cristina, you're smiling, so you win.
I'm smiling because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not able to say, from a legal perspective, how feasible that is. But what I could say is that indeed, we have seen and heard, an express interest from several parties to hold snap elections. Even today, we heard that also from the Democratic Party, that they would be interested in snap elections. So this is seen as of now by a group of political forces as the only way to move forward from the stalemate that is currently created and the very fragile majority that the socialists still hold in the parliament. So from this perspective, I think that there is interest. It's a matter of discussions and negotiations, and of course the legal aspect here is also very important. I will maybe give the word to Nicu, but from a legal perspective, I'm not able to add more here.
Go ahead, Nicu, please.
Listen, there is no easy answer. To me, my very personal expectation is that in the short term, there will be a consolidation in the parliament against Maia Sandu. There's too many people and political parties that will not find themselves in the next parliament. So the survival instinct of too many MPs is now at stake. At the same time, in the last 1 year and a few days, that's technically we're facing the 4th parliamentary majority. The socialists were in all of them, but this is the 4th majority in more or less a year. So I don't expect this short-term consolidation on an anti-Maia Sandu platform in the parliament to last for long. And at some point down the road, there will be some openings to reset the political system. There's also many people, Maia Sandu is on the record saying that she would want to have a new parliament that is more representative. Of course, that can only be done in a legal manner. But there's also other players, if you want, probably I suspect in the Socialist Party that might benefit from a resetting of their own party. And I'd like to draw a parallel here. Before in Moldova, you had corrupt pro-Europeans. Maia Sandu distanced herself and built a not corrupt pro-European political force and won. If the Moldovan Socialist Party and the Moldovan left can do the same, shed those leaders who have been very credibly seen in very corrupt circumstances, that's something that would benefit the Socialist Party and Moldovan politics as a whole if Moldovan political parties are corrupt. So there's people like that in the Socialist Party as well. They also might have an interest to try and reset and move on from that phase of cooperation where the Socialist Party became, an annex to Plahotniuc and to corrupt interests. That doesn't give you a legal answer, but what I'm telling you is, if Moldovan politics teaches us anything, is that yes, today Dodon still has a majority in parliament. That's a shaky majority. It's a weak majority. It depends on several independent MPs. And I would be extremely surprised if that shaky majority lasts for long or allows for a clear cut, for a lot of decision-making power for the outgoing president.
No, it's a really good point, Nicu, that in some ways the lesson from Sandu might be learned by people from within the socialist camp, that they can split off and they can repeat this kind of success, especially by campaigning against corruption. Bill, you're welcome to jump in on this topic as well, but I also wanted to bring in a question about Transnistria, if I can. Paul Mickelson, professor of history, emeritus from Huntington University, is asking if the Transnistria conflict is going to continue to be frozen. I've never been a big fan of that term, but his term, or do you think it will make its way back onto the Moldovan political agenda?
Well, thanks, Matt. It's never been frozen and it's never been off the political agenda, but frankly, in Moldovan electoral politics, it's not at the top of it hasn't been at the top of the agenda for a long time. As a former negotiator, I knew that when I was there, that it was, there are other things that go into that. Transnistria has basically, the authorities in Transnistria have entrenched themselves, and they are part of a separate, de facto separate entity, but they are entrenched in the political, economic, and social system of the region. Without cooperation from influential people in Moldova proper, in Romania and Ukraine, Transnistria would not survive. It also requires Russian support, but it's a significant part of the overall economic pattern that has developed in the region and been going on for the past 25 years or more. Transnistria has also become now participating in the DCFTA, a great deal of its trade having reoriented or gone back, as it was semi-legally in the 1990s, gone back to Western Europe, European Union countries. Transnistria is a large part of the Moldovan economic and legal economic space. The political questions are not solved, and they may take some time to resolve, but it's one where it's not the most important issue. Certainly hasn't been to Moldovan voters and Moldovan populations. To the previous question, the one thing I just wanted to add was that it may turn out to be unimportant, it may turn out to be transitory, but I'm struck by the role that Usati played in this result and the potential, if he stays as a charismatic figure. Whether he's a populist or not, I don't know. He's a mysterious figure because he appeared in 2014. There's a mysterious, but in this election, he played an important role. And the fact that Sandu in the past took notes is it's another striking result. It's not as important as the participation of the diaspora, but it shows a sign for Moldovan politics, getting shaken up. And for the fact they might have to wait for 6 months for snap elections, but when the snap elections come, the electoral calculus may be very, very different for the politicians taking part that could lead to a very different result in Moldova. Of course, those political leaders working in Moldova now they actually have to do this. They have to undertake the actions and negotiations and make the deals themselves. But there's an avenue open here that wasn't during a large part of the time that I've been both working in Moldova and living in Moldova. So interesting times, interesting possibilities.
Let me mention the Voldemortian figure of Moldovan politics, he who shall not be named, Vlad Plahotniuc. It's interesting how little corruption and vote buying and sort of typical oligarch games were part of this story. Is that because he's on the run? What is the Plahotniuc dimension of Moldovan politics today, and especially in the wake of this victory? Is it cleansing, or again, and here I think about the comparison with Ukraine. Inevitably, are we going to see kind of an inevitable return to a center of gravity that is very much about that kind of oligarch story? Cristina, again, you have the smile and the nod, so I'll go to you.
Sure, Matt. So my take on this is that it would very much depend on the evolutions within the political parties in Moldova. So for now, we see really a window of opportunity also for the socialists in a way to change perspectives, to change behavior, to change patterns in Moldovan politics. It will very much depend, whether Dodon stays a central figure since he is in quest for a new immunity umbrella, or is it going to be, given to someone else considering his loss of legitimacy after this election round. So a lot of, part of the answer on whether or to what extent Plahotniuc comes back to Moldovan politics depends on the reshape of the party's behavior. What we do know is that he is behind several political forces in the Moldovan parliament today. So he's not keeping, in a way, his eggs in one basket. That would also tell us that there is an interest to return. We see that being abroad and moving moving from one country to another is not that sustainable for him. So we might see more of him coming back. It also depends, on how the parties on the right spectrum are going to evolve, how much leverage they will have on politics, and how much they would be able to form a strong coalition against more corrupt parties and more corrupt behavior. So from this perspective, I would say, yes, there is a huge opportunity for Plahotniuc to return, but probably in a very different form than he used to dominate the Moldovan politics prior to last summer.
Anyone else want to comment on Plaha? No, I don't see any eagerness there. Okay, so we have plenty more questions from the audience. Let me pull a couple more of those in. Robert H. Lofter-Thun, CEO of Eco Catalyst Foundation, asks, how would you characterize the impact of youth and civil society in the Moldova presidential election? Great question. Who wants to tackle that? Christina, go ahead, please. You guys are too deferential, or maybe you're just tired.
Probably tiredness as well. So when it comes to civil society and youth, as I have mentioned, especially the diaspora abroad has mobilized a very sizable chunk of them abroad. These are mostly students. These are people who finished their studies and did not find any kind of professional opportunities in the country and decided to leave. So here we do see that the youth has significantly mobilized. Civil society, I think today plays the role of a watchdog over Moldovan politics, and they're also helping mobilize the electorate within the country to understand what's going on and to understand what are the stakes in this election and what comes next. So I think the degree of mobilization that we've seen is very much also a result of how active the civil society was to explain what happened during the pre-electoral campaign, to explain the risks during the day of the election, and to explain what kind of risks might come after. So from this perspective, hats off in front of the civil society organizations and think tanks that made sure to raise awareness about what's going on and what's at stake here.
Nicu, I want to ask you a follow-up on that, if I can. I mean, look, you came from civil society, you served in a government with Maia Sandu as prime minister. Is she going to be building that sort of technocratic government again, drawing on civil society, working in partnership with civil society? Again, to point to Ukraine, one could argue that that has been one of the missed opportunities of Ukraine, is kind of animosity and distance between the government and civil society.
Absolutely, Maia has been very closely supported by much of what is civil society in Moldova, precisely because she's been someone who is very democratic, has always been very pluralistic in her treatment of political opponents and supporters. Now the impact of civil society and youth has been very big, but has been also very different. I think in Moldova, you have several very partisan media. Many of them are Russian media with a lot of influence in the Moldovan debate, but you have several very good independent TV channels, which have meant that for the last 10 years, Moldova has had a very pluralist political space. You have a very active civil society, which is highly qualified. It's partly because Moldova doesn't have a very kind of dynamic economy, because actually the hard truth is that if you're someone who's very competent and well educated, if you're in Azerbaijan or Ukraine or Russia, chances are many of these people end up in big businesses, in oil, in Moldova. Actually, some of the best educated Moldovans go into NGOs and politics as well. So but actually you have a kind of vacuum effect to a degree in Moldovan NGOs. So you have a very dynamic, very active civil society, which has a huge impact on the political debate in the country. And you have a good revolving door, as you can see. Actually, on that, Moldova is also quite good on having a revolving door and a pretty high degree of influence of civil society on the political process. And that has been the case for quite some time. When you have 30 NGOs making statements on Transnistria or on relations with the EU, all governments listen. And that has been used as a leverage several times in Moldovan history to put pressure on the government, and that usually has an effect.
Nicu, I like to joke that you're the guy who gives the revolving door, which has such a bad reputation in Washington, and labor migration, which also has a bad reputation. You give it a good name. Bill, I want to go to you for this, please.
Matt, yeah, no, I wanted to say, following on what Christina and Nicu said, is not to, both to applaud the contribution of civil society in Moldova, but one of the things, the result of this election and the participation in this election underlines is that a substantial proportion of Moldovan civil society, especially the younger part of Moldovan civil society, is abroad. If you look at the numbers that participated in Romania, France, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, just thousands and thousands of young Moldovans over the past 2 decades have left Moldova because of lack of opportunity, lack of space, other things. If you travel, live in Moldova, travel around in the countryside through towns and villages, you see the effects on the country of the absence of so much talented, young, working power. In this election, these people working, these Moldovans working, especially in Central and Western Europe, elsewhere too, but especially in Central and Western Europe, have shown a continuing interest and participation in Moldovan civic and political life. And hopefully, this, one of the things that matters in the future of Moldovan society and the economy is the fact of bringing some of these Moldovans back to Moldova and getting them to work in Moldova because society is so thin on the ground in the working age population. And in this sense, the fact that these people are still feel a connection to Moldova, care about it enough to participate, perhaps this is a step in turning around a phenomenon that has really been one of the sources of Moldova's continuing ills over the past 2 decades. This won't happen all at once, but in this sense, this is one of the encouraging aspects that I see of this election, and something that's new that we haven't seen before, and could, if it goes in a good direction, contribute to a much brighter future for this country, which is deserving. And I'll say one other thing. I mean, Nicu has pointed to this. This is a country that, once again, every election in Moldova, since the first ones in the early 1990s when Moldova got independence, they've not always been perfect, but they've been competitive, they've been free, they've been open, and Moldovan political parties, Moldovan political forces have respected the results. Not too many countries in the world have a record as good as this in holding elections and observing their results. And as such, it's a country that's deserving of whatever support from the outside can be given to keep this record up and to help those who voted for change actually realize it in Moldova.
I actually want to pick up on that last point about support from the outside for a final question for all 3 of you. We have basically steered clear of, as has Moldova thus far, of the kind of classic geopolitical ping pong story. My question, though, is to put a bit of a finer point maybe on the difficulty, which is one might expect in the incoming US administration with its enthusiasm for democracy promotion, a lot of people potentially coming in that have experience with the region, are very committed to the region. One might expect a massive upgrade in attention and maybe development assistance and democracy assistance coming to the region. I'm curious what you think about that, but I'm also interested to know if you see any kind of resolution for kind of the classical problem, which is the more of that kind of engagement from the West, and especially from the United States, that a country in Moldova's position gets, the more it is perceived by Russia and by forces domestically that align themselves with Russia as threatening some type of escape, right? Escape from Russia's geopolitical orbit, from an economic relationship with Russia, from a neutral status, which Nicu mentioned earlier is enshrined in Moldova's constitution, et cetera. I mean, if there is a perceived upgrade from where we are now, which is, I think, pretty limited in terms of US assistance under the Trump administration, in the next administration, is it also necessarily going to trigger more of a geopolitical problem with Russia? So it's kind of a cluster of questions about the geopolitics. Who might want to take that on?
I will probably.
Go ahead, Nico.
Listen, I think US engagement and support for Moldova has been quite systematic. It did not change a lot from one administration to another in the last decade. So there haven't been huge variations. Usually the US is very engaged. It has supported many NGOs, independent media, both offering them diplomatic help when these media found themselves under pressure from various governments in Moldova, and that happened a few times. And there has been financial support. Maintaining that, the Europeans have done the same. The European Endowment for Democracy is an important player in this field. And that's been happening non-stop for more than 20 years. I don't see why this should pose a problem for Russia. If you want, I don't want to kind of think and over-interpret what Russia might be thinking. But of course, all of this type of assistance for civil society in Moldova has been happening non-stop for the last 25 years. It's not, and if it would suddenly start happening on a much more massive scale in other post-Soviet countries, be it Belarus or be it Armenia, we've seen and we've heard voices in Moscow that could be itchy about that. Well, in Moldova, that's standard practice. Moldova has an open political space. It's been there. It's been open to close partnership with the US. With Russia, relations tended to, Moldova usually tried to go out of its way to maintain that relationship stable. It didn't always work. But Moldovan leaders almost never engaged in hostile rhetoric against Russia. I also mentioned the neutrality status of Moldova, which is an explicit Moldovan decision from the early 90s to remove this issue of military alliances from potentially troubling relations with Moscow. So Moldova has done its bits of avoiding a hostile. So I don't see this as a zero-sum game, if you ask me, and I don't see why Russia should significantly. But I'd also like to draw your attention to some recent facts or serious allegations of Russian interference. This has happened. The last weeks we've had independent NGOs and journalists chasing in town Russian political consultants who have not been declared in the party, in the political spending of the Socialist Party, which amounts to illegal external financing of a campaign. We've had this situation. President Dodon is himself boasted on a leaked video that he receives cash monthly from Russia. We also have that situation, right, which unfortunately significantly imbalances the capacity of the Moldovan political parties to have a fair campaign. And despite that huge asymmetry in resources between the socialists and the other political parties, still the socialists lost. So that also tells you a lot about the efficiency of such interventions. If you ask me, they've mostly complicated Russia's capacity to have a normal and constructive relationship with a country like Moldova.
If I were one of these Russian political consultants, I would not put this campaign on my marketing page. But I guess they'll continue to spin their own narrative. Cristina, do you want to comment on this and also any final thoughts you might have?
Sure. So I will try to build a little bit on what Nicu has just mentioned. I fully agree, that Moldova, since its independence, in a way enjoyed support for its democratic transition, its efforts in fighting corruption, and, in its ambitions in a way to get closer to Europe and once part of the EU family. So from this perspective, the EU, the IMF, and other similarly, organizations have in a way supported Moldova. We did see a reduction from during the Trump administration, but I think, we could. My expectations, considering how full the foreign policy agenda of President-elect Biden will be, particularly in the first 1 year, to redo all the connections that have been damaged with the EU and with major global players. Moldova will be by far not even among its pool of smaller countries a priority, but it will probably enjoy support in the context of more interest and more interest for democracy promotion. Here I would just like to add the Russian perspective a bit. I mean, what we have seen in this campaign is, a portrayal of Western support as an expectation of a Maidan for Moldova. We've seen also in the Russian narrative that, in case of a Sandu win, we might see a lot of pressure being put on Russia. So we saw a lot of disinformation that was trying to disorient the ordinary voter out there. But we also saw the message of President Putin, who's expecting a working relationship with Maia Sandu. So from this perspective, I think there is also clear pragmatism on behalf of Moscow that there is not much to worry. So to jump back now, back to the Moldovan-US relations, I think it's also a matter of how much will there is to engage on the Moldovan side with the support that comes from the US, rather than unilaterally the other side, the other way around. So to finish here, I would just say that from an assistance perspective, I mean, the United States has provided since independence over $1.5 billion for Moldova. It currently provides around 25 million per year for strengthening economic growth, competitiveness, the work on reforms to improve the business climate, the developing democratic governance. If the Moldovan society could absorb this money, I would say, yes, we should worry that there is not more coming. But for now, I think we're good. So I'll stop just here.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, both Nicu and Cristina. And I didn't mean to imply that the relationship had disappeared over the last 4 years. In fact, I was very pleased to see the photo of John Bolton and Nicu during Bolton's, as National Security Advisor, his visit to Chisinau. So that may not be a high-level visit that's repeated soon, or it may be, but certainly it was significant. Bill, you have the final word. Any thoughts on this or anything else you'd like to close with?
Okay, thanks, Matt. No, I wouldn't exclude that a new administration would not pay significant attention to Moldova. I mean, the US has a lot of things to deal with, but we're a big country and we have a lot of capabilities, and we should be able to do a number of things. I think that the important thing in the geopolitical issues, the geopolitical calculus, we don't need to pursue reorientation. I think the election shows the Moldovan population knows where it's going, and continued support from the US for existing efforts such as rule of law, judicial reform, economic development, infrastructure building, should be uncontroversial and very helpful in assisting a new Moldovan president, and at some point a further Moldovan government move in the direction that the population wants to. This is something, and it's something that should not provoke others that are involved in Moldova. We can seek to work constructively with Moscow and just make it up to Moscow whether they accept that invitation and offer to do so. It has worked in the past, over the past 5 years, in certain things involving Moldova and Transnistria. There's no reason why it can't work in the future. That's not a guarantee, but it is an indication that the question is open, and it depends on what we do. And I think if we steer the right line, we have a real opportunity here to do some of the things that we've tried to do before, but have a different and better result. So let's work on that.
Bill, what an ideal, optimistic note to end on. Thank you all three very much. Whatever happens, of course, will continue to follow. Controversial to say that the overwhelming majority of those tuned in today and the many wonderful active questions that we had indicates that there is a strong interest from Washington and from the United States in continued strong relations with Moldova. So we'll definitely continue to cover it. Thank you all three again so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in. That's it for now. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.